Nobody walks 4 kilometers through a Montreal whiteout to ask for a dishwashing job. They walk that far because the thing behind them is worse than the cold. Lucan Mercier saw her before his doorman did. He was standing at the tall window of the Saint Léon's mezzanine, watching the storm bury Rue de la Commune, when a shape detached itself from the snow at the service entrance below. A young woman, no toque, no proper coat, just a man's canvas jacket 2 sizes too big, and a grocery bag held to her chest like it held something breakable. There was a child pressed into her side. Mercier had spent 22 years learning to read people in the half-second before they lied to him, and what he read in the way she squared her shoulders before knocking wasn't desperation. It was pride trying to survive desperation. She wasn't there to beg. She'd decided somewhere in that long walk that she would offer something instead. He went down himself. He didn't usually. By the time he reached the kitchen corridor, Bishop already had the door open, and the 2 of them inside, dripping onto the rubber mat, and the whole back of house had gone quiet, the way a room goes quiet when something fragile enters it. The woman's lips were nearly gray. Snow had crusted in her dark hair and along her eyelashes. The bag in her arms turned out to be the child. No, the child was beside her. The bag held a thermos and a one-eyed stuffed fox, and what looked like everything else the 2 of them owned. "I'm not here for a handout," she said before anyone could speak. Her teeth were chattering and she was furious about it. "I'll work. Dishes, prep, mopping, whatever you've got. I've done kitchens. I just need it to be tonight, and I need it to be somewhere he." She stopped, started again. "Somewhere we won't be on a list." "What's your name?" Mercier said. Not a question the way he said most things. "Esme. Esme Doucette." "A beat. This is Theo." The boy was maybe 7. He had his sister's dark eyes and a face that had learned, far too early, to take up as little room as possible. He stood half behind her hip with the fox crushed against his sternum, and when Mercier's gaze settled on him, the child looked down at the wet floor and whispered, "I'm sorry about the snow." The whole corridor heard it. Sorry about the snow. Not sorry to intrude, not sorry to be a bother. Sorry about weather he could not control, as though mess of any kind was a thing he'd been taught to fear. Marisol, who'd run that kitchen for 19 years and had buried 2 husbands and feared no living thing, set down her ladle very carefully. Mercier crouched. It cost him something to do it. He was a tall man in a charcoal suit, and people did not generally see him fold himself down to a child's eye level. But he did it slowly, keeping his hands where the boy could see them, the way you'd approach a dog that had been kicked. "The snow's mine," Mercier said. "It's my floor. You didn't bring it in. The storm did. You owe me nothing for it." Theo's eyes flicked up, measuring him. They were old eyes. They moved across Mercier's face the way a person checks a room for exits. "Are you going to make us leave when she's done working?" the boy asked. And there it was. The real question. The one the whole walk had been built around. Esme's breath caught. She put a hand on the back of her brother's head, not to quiet him, Mercier thought, but to brace him for the answer. "No," Mercier said. He had Odette take them up to the 3rd floor, to 2 of the staff rooms that hadn't been used since the renovation, and he had Marisol send up soup and bread and warm milk, and he had Bishop stand in the corridor, not as a guard, he told Bishop, as a wall, something solid between these 2 and the door. Esme didn't eat until Theo did, and Theo didn't eat until she nodded at him twice, and even then he ate the bread in small careful bites and folded the crusts into a napkin to keep, which broke Odette's heart so thoroughly that she had to go stand in the stairwell. Later, when the boy was asleep, really asleep, finally, Fox tucked under his chin, Esme came and found Mercier in the small office off the kitchen where he was pretending to do paperwork. "I'll start tomorrow," she said. "Early. Whatever shift you've got." "Sit down, Esme." She sat on the edge of the chair, ready to stand again. "I don't need to know all of it tonight," he said. "But I need to know one thing, because it changes what I do next. Is there someone looking for you? And is it the law, or is it a person?" Her jaw worked. For a moment, he thought she'd lie. People always wanted to, with him. They thought a smaller story would be safer. "A person," she said. His name is Garrett Dunmore. She said the name the way you'd name a tumor. He's not our father. He's not anyone's anything. He had an arrangement with our mom before she passed. Money she owed. He's been collecting on it ever since, and 3 months ago he found a lawyer who told him there was a way to make Theo his problem on paper. Guardianship. He doesn't want Theo. He wants the check that comes with him. The survivor's benefit. The supplement. He worked it out that he gets more keeping the kid than collecting the debt. She pressed her thumbnail hard into the meat of her palm. He hits, not me mostly. Me, he just frightens. Theo, she stopped. She didn't finish it, and Mercier didn't ask her to. He thought about a number of things he could do to Garrett Dunmore. He'd built the first half of his life on knowing how to make a man disappear so completely that even the asking stopped. The kitchen below them ran on his name. Half the cargo that moved through the old port in the 80s had moved because he'd said it could. He was not, by any honest accounting, a good man, and he had stopped trying to convince himself otherwise around the time his hair started going gray at the temples. But he'd also learned the hard, expensive way, that a body in the river solves one problem and creates 4. And the 4 it would create would land on the 2 people upstairs. Tomorrow you don't wash dishes, he said. Tomorrow you tell me the lawyer's name and the amount and every paper you ever signed. Tonight you sleep. Nobody comes through that door but Odette and Marisol, and Bishop will be in the hall until the city plows are running. He stood. He frightens you, this Dunmore. Does he frighten you here? Esme looked around the little office, the cracked leather, the brass lamp, the snow ticking against the window, the enormous quiet man in the expensive suit who hadn't once raised his voice. Something in her face loosened a 1/4 inch. No, she admitted, like it surprised her. Good, said Mercier. Keep it that way. It's the most useful thing you can give the kid. The healing of a frightened child is not a montage. Mercier knew that, even if the rest of them had to learn it. It happens in increments so small you could miss them if you weren't keeping count, and the Saint Leon, almost despite itself, began to keep count. The first week, Theo apologized roughly 40 times a day. He apologized for being in the hall. He apologized for the sound the milk made when he drank it. He apologized once, devastatingly, for laughing, clapped both hands over his mouth the instant it slipped out, eyes wide with the certainty that joy was a thing you got punished for. It was Odette who took that one on. Odette was 71, 4'11", and had raised 6 children and an unkillable number of grandchildren in a 3rd-floor walk-up off St. Denis, and she had no patience whatever for the idea that a child should be quiet to be safe. In this hotel, she told Theo, in the slow, careful English she used when something mattered, the loud people are the ones who stay. You want to know who gets thrown out? The quiet ones, the ones who whisper in corners. She tapped his nose. So you, mon petit, you're going to have to learn to be a nuisance, or Monsieur Mercier will think you don't like it here. Theo considered this with great seriousness. I do like it here, he said. Then I expect noise, said Odette. He gave her a small, doubtful, experimental noise, a sort of squawk, and looked terrified, and when nothing bad happened, he did it again. Bishop was the hardest. Bishop was 6'4" and built like a loading dock, with a scar that pulled one eyebrow permanently upward, and a stillness that made even Mercier's lawyers nervous. Theo gave him the widest berth, flattened himself against the wall when Bishop passed, the way he must have learned to do in some hallway in some apartment with thin walls. So Bishop did the only thing that ever works, which is nothing. He stopped trying to be gentle, because gentle from a man that size only frightened the boy more. Instead, he became predictable. He knocked before he came into any room. He said, "Coming through, bud," before he rounded a corner, every single time, so the boy was never startled. When he brought up the breakfast tray, he set it down and stepped back 3 full paces before he said a word. Safety, for a kid like Theo, wasn't kindness. There was a thing happening the same way, twice. The turn came on a Thursday. Theo had been allowed to sit in the corner of the kitchen with a coloring book, while Esme worked the prep station. She did work. Eventually, She would not be talked out of it, and the boy dropped a crayon under the steel counter and went down after it on his hands and knees. Bishop crossed the kitchen at the same moment, saw the boy, and without thinking bent and picked up the crayon. The movement made Theo flinch back so hard he cracked his head on the underside of the counter. The whole kitchen froze. Esme started toward them. Bishop went very still, the crayon, a blue one, pinched between two fingers like something he might be accused of stealing. Then, slowly, he turned his hand over and held it out, flat, the way you'd offer a treat to a horse. Blue, Bishop said, as if naming evidence in a file. Theo stared at the crayon. He stared at the scarred hand around it. After a long time, he reached out and took it, and his small fingers brushed Bishop's palm for less than a second, and he did not pull away. A week later, Bishop taught him a handshake, a high five into two knuckle taps into a nonsense flourish that ended with Bishop making an absurd popping sound with his cheek. Theo got it wrong 4 times, frowned like a tiny accountant, and got it right on the 5th, and when Bishop made the pop, the boy laughed, a real one, surprised out of him before the fear could catch it, and clapped a hand over his mouth from sheer habit. This time nobody told him to stop. Marisol turned from the stove smiling. Esme stood with a knife in one hand and a half-cut onion in the other, and didn't bother to hide that she was crying, and Bishop, who hadn't looked anyone in the eye on purpose in 11 years, rubbed the back of his neck and said, "Don't tell anybody," and the boy nodded, solemn as a judge. Secret. Mercier watched the whole thing from the office doorway and said nothing, which was how he said most things. Esme came along slower, the way people do when they're old enough to know what they're risking. With her the work was different. She had to be taught not to apologize the way Theo did, but the apology in her was quieter and more stubborn. She apologized for asking when her shift ended. She apologized for needing Theo's school sorted out, because Mercier had, without making a production of it, had Odette walk the boy to the little school 3 blocks over and enroll him under a name only the principal and one trusted teacher knew, and Esme had not been able to say thank you without saying sorry in the same breath. "You keep doing that," Mercier said one evening. They were in the kitchen after close. He was drinking coffee he didn't need. She was rolling napkins she hadn't been asked to roll. "Doing what?" "Apologizing for taking up the space you're standing in." She set the napkin down. "It's a hard habit." "I know what taught it to you," he said. "I'm telling you that here, that habit makes you a liability. I need people who tell me what they need in plain words and don't waste my time being sorry about it. So." He put the coffee down. "What do you need, Esme? Not what you'll settle for, what you need." She was quiet so long he thought she wouldn't answer. "Then I need to know he can never take Theo. Not on paper, not with police, not ever. I need it to be over, not just paused." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she let it, didn't apologize for that either, which Mercier counted privately as progress. "And I need." She stopped, and her chin came up the way it had at the service door. "I want to finish my nursing course. I had 2 semesters before everything fell apart. I want to be the person who's in the room when somebody's the most scared they've ever been, and I want to be the reason they're less scared. That's what I need. The whole thing, not half of it." Mercier looked at her for a moment in a way that was new, not the read he gave to threats and liars, but something steadier. "Then we'll get you the whole thing," he said. It was around then, he'd realize later, that she stopped calling him Mr. Mercier. Garrett Dunmore came on a Tuesday, 4 days into a January thaw, when the streets were running gray with meltwater and the city had let its guard down the way it always does. The first warm day after a freeze. He came through the front, which was its own kind of arrogance, into the lobby of the St. Leon in a camel coat that cost more than it should have, with a leather folio under one arm and a lawyer trailing him, and he asked the front desk, pleasant as anything, whether they employed a young woman named Esme Doucet. He had documents, he explained, smiling. A family matter. His ward had been taken from his lawful care. He just wanted the boy home. The front desk girl, 18, knew, froze, and that freeze was answer enough. Dunmore's smile widened. He never made it past the lobby. Esme heard the commotion from the kitchen, and the sound that came out of her was not a scream. It was worse. It was the small, flat sound of a person who has been waiting a long time for the worst thing to arrive, and is almost relieved it finally has. She had Theo by the wrist and was halfway up the back stairs before Marisol caught her. "None," Marisol said, low, holding her by both shoulders. "You don't run. Not in this house. In this house, he runs." Bishop had already moved. By the time Mercier came down, unhurried, always unhurried, buttoning his jacket on the stairs, Bishop stood between Dunmore and the rest of the lobby like a closed door, and the few guests who'd been checking in had been quietly steered toward the bar. Dunmore held up the folio. "I don't want trouble. I've got a custody order. I've got the boy's paperwork. I've got the law on my side, and I will come back with police if I have to, so let's all be reasonable adults." He looked past Bishop, found Mercier, and made the mistake of recognizing him without understanding him. "Mercier, I know your name. I'd think a man like you wouldn't want the kind of attention a missing kid story brings to his hotel." Mercier crossed the marble slowly. He stopped a comfortable distance away, hands loose at his sides. "You're right," he said. "I don't want attention. So let me save us both some. I've spent 4 days reading about you, Mr. Dunmore. You're not a careful man. Careful men don't leave a trail like yours." He tilted his head. "The guardianship application you filed in December lists you as the children's stepfather. You were never married to Colette Doucette. There's no record of it anywhere, because it didn't happen. That's a false statement, sworn. The survivor's benefit you've been redirecting since October goes to an account you control, not to the child's care. That's fraud against the federal government, and they take that one personally. And the loan you say their mother owed you, the one this whole thing rests on, was an unlicensed cash loan at a rate that makes it a criminal offense on its own. You didn't lend money, Mr. Dunmore. You committed a crime, and then you tried to collect a child as interest." The lobby was very quiet. Dunmore's lawyer had gone the color of the marble. "You can't prove." "I have copies of every page in that folio under your arm, and several you don't know exist," Mercier said. "I have them because you are not nearly as clever as you've needed people to believe, and because I employ people who are. Here is what's going to happen. You're going to sit down at that table by the window. You're going to sign 3 documents. The first relinquishes any claim, present or future, to Theo Doucette permanently. The second is a sworn statement acknowledging the fraud, which my lawyer will hold and which goes to the RCMP the day you so much as drive down this street again. The third is a no-contact undertaking covering both children for the rest of your natural life." He let that sit. "And then you're going to walk out of here and start over somewhere far from this city, and you're going to spend the rest of that life being quietly, deeply grateful that you did it with your name and your freedom intact, because I had other options on the table this morning, and the people upstairs are the only reason I chose this one." Dunmore looked at the table. He looked at Bishop, who hadn't moved. He looked at the lawyer, who had already begun, very slightly, to inch toward the door. "And if I don't sign?" "Then I make 1 phone call," Mercier said. "And by tonight 3 separate agencies are reading the same file, and you spend what's left of your money on lawyers instead of a fresh start. The signing is the mercy, Mr. Dunmore. I'd take it. It won't be offered twice." He signed. His hand shook badly enough that the lawyer had to steady the page. When it was done, Bishop walked him to the revolving door, not touching him, just close, and Dunmore stopped on the threshold and turned his head. One last reflex of a man who'd spent his life having the last word. "He'll always know what he came from," Dunmore said. "You can dress him up in your fancy hotel. He'll always know." Mercier didn't rise to it. "He'll know exactly what he came from," he agreed. "And he'll know what he got out to. Goodbye, Mr. Dunmore." The door turned, and the gray afternoon swallowed the camel coat, and that was the last anyone at the St. Leon ever saw of Garrett Dunmore, who was, in fact, arrested 14 months later in Hamilton on an unrelated fraud, and who never came within 200 kilometers of the boy again, because cowards who lose their leverage rarely have the nerve to look for it twice. Upstairs, Esme had heard none of it. She had Theo on her lap in the staff room, both of them rigid, waiting for the sound of him on the stairs, When the knock came, she nearly stopped breathing. But it was the right knock. 2 raps and a pause. Bishop's knock, and then Bishop's voice through the door, careful as ever. "Coming in, bud." "Just me." He opened the door and crouched in the frame so he wasn't looming, and he looked at Theo, not at Esme. "He's gone," Bishop said. "For real gone. Not the kind where he comes back." Mr. Mercier made sure. He held out his fist for the knuckle tap. "We good?" Theo looked at him for a long moment, the old eyes doing their old work, checking the statement for the lie in it. He found none. He tapped Bishop's knuckles and did the nonsense flourish, and made the cheek pop himself badly, and it was the bravest sound Esme had ever heard a person make. Then Theo turned to his sister and asked the only question that had ever really mattered to him. "Do we still have to be quiet?" "No, baby," Esme said. "We never did, we just didn't know it yet." The guardianship hearing came in the spring, after the snow had finally given up the corners of the parking lots and the trees along the river had gone that impossible green. They only manage for about 10 days a year. Mercier paid for the lawyer and said nothing about it. The judge, a tired, decent woman who'd seen every shabby version of this story and was visibly relieved to see one going right for once, granted Esme full permanent guardianship of her brother, with the survivor's benefit restored and redirected to an account in the boy's name that even Esme couldn't touch until he turned 18, which had been Mercier's quiet condition. He should have something that's only his, he'd said. Kids like that, they need to know there's one thing nobody can take. Theo wore a clip-on tie Odette had bought him and sat between the two of them on the courthouse bench, swinging his feet, holding the one-eyed fox in his lap, because he'd refused to leave Biscuit at home for something this important. When the judge said the word granted, he didn't understand it right away. He looked up at his sister, then at Mercier, waiting to be told whether this was the good kind of thing or the kind you brace for. "It means he can never come back," Esme told him, and her voice did something complicated. "It means you're mine. Officially. On paper. Forever." Theo absorbed this. Then he frowned, the little accountant frown, and looked at Mercier. "What's he, then?" he asked his sister, pointing the fox at the tall man in the gray suit. "If you're mine on paper." Esme opened her mouth and found, for once, that she had no ready answer. She'd spent the winter learning to call him Lucan instead of Mr. Beads. Mercier, learning the particular weight of standing beside him in a kitchen at 2 in the morning rolling napkins nobody needed, learning that the steadiness she'd first mistaken for coldness was the most reliable warmth she'd ever stood near. She had not let herself name the thing it was turning into, because naming things had always, in her experience, been how you lost them. Mercier saved her the trouble, the way he'd saved her a number of things. "I'm whatever the two of you need me to be," he said to the boy. "There's no paper for it. You don't have to decide today." Theo decided anyway. That was the thing about Theo. Once he started taking up room, he took it. It was June by then, a warm, wet evening with the harbor wind coming up Rue de la Commune, and the Sat-Leon's front windows thrown open for the first time all year. Marisol had made a cake without being asked. A ridiculous thing. 3 tiers with a lopsided fox in white icing on top, because Theo had described Biscuit to her in exhausting detail. Odette had strung lights in the private dining room. Bishop stood near the door with his arms crossed, trying and failing to look like a man who didn't care about any of it. The staff had gathered in their good blacks, pretending they weren't all waiting to see the boy's face. When Theo saw the cake, saw the lopsided fox, saw the lights, saw the banner Odette had lettered herself because no one else met her standards, "Welcome home" in careful blue capitals, he went completely still. The old still, the bracing still. For one terrible second, Esme thought the joy of it might frighten him the way joy still sometimes did. Then he crossed the room, walked straight up to Lucan Mercier, and tugged on the hem of his jacket until the big man bent down. "Is it okay?" Theo asked in the smallest, most careful voice. "If I call you something? Even if there's no paper for it?" Mercier knelt. He knelt the way he'd knelt at the service store in the snow, the way he'd knelt to take a blue crayon from a frightened kid, the way he'd decided somewhere along the line he would always meet this child, where he stood instead of making him climb. "You can call me anything you want," he said. Theo looked at his sister for permission. Esme nodded, her hand over her mouth. Okay, the boy said, and tested the shape of it against the warm June air like it might not hold. Okay, Dad. The room broke. Not into the kind of applause that would have frightened him, but into the softer kind. The kind that holds a person up. Marisol pressed her apron to her eyes. Odette beamed through tears she'd stopped pretending she didn't have. Bishop looked hard at the ceiling and muttered something nobody chose to hear. And Esme stood in the middle of the room that had taken them in off the street 4 kilometers and a whole lifetime ago, and watched the most feared man in that part of the city kneel on his own floor and gather her little brother up like he was the only thing in any of it that had ever made sense. And she thought, with the clear, quiet certainty of someone who has finally stopped bracing, we're going to keep this. Nobody's giving this one back. Much later, after the cake was cut and the last of the staff had gone home, and Theo was asleep upstairs with Biscuit under his chin, and the lights of the old port low on the water, Mercier found Esme on the mezzanine at the tall window where he'd first seen her in the snow. He asked me if you'd still be here in the morning, she said, not turning around. I told him yes. I hope that wasn't mine to promise. Mercier came and stood beside her. Below them the street was wet and empty and warm. It was yours to promise, he said. I'll just be the one who keeps it. She looked at him then, really looked, the way she looked at the office and the snow and the enormous quiet man who hadn't raised his voice, except now she wasn't measuring whether it was safe. She'd known that for months. Lucan, she said, just to say it, just because she finally could without accosting her anything. Esme, he answered. And when the morning came, he was still there. So was the boy, running down the 3rd-floor hall in his sock feet, calling for both of them at once, loud as anything, a complete and glorious nuisance, exactly as he'd been promised he was allowed to be. What stays with me about Esme Dosad isn't the walk through the storm, though 4 kilometers in a borrowed jacket with a kid on your hip is its own kind of miracle. It's that when she finally reached a warm door, she didn't ask to be saved. She asked to work. She had lost nearly everything a person can lose, and she still wouldn't let go of the one thing that was hers to keep. The refusal to make herself small. That refusal is what carried her across the city that night, and it's the thing I'd want anyone watching to carry too. The stubborn, unglamorous willingness to keep getting up when staying down would be so much easier. But getting up wasn't enough on its own, and the story is honest about that. Esme could have run the afternoon Garrett Dunmore walked into that lobby. Every nerve in her body was screaming at her to grab Theo and bolt. It was Marisol who held her still, and it was Lucan Mercier who understood the thing she was too frightened to see, that running would have followed her forever, and the only way out was straight through the middle of it. He didn't end it with his fists, though everyone in that room expected him to. He ended it with patience and paperwork and the cold, careful sense to know that a man like Dunmore undoes himself with his own record, not with a beating. That's the part people skip past. The smart way through was almost never the loud one. And underneath all of it sat a choice that had nothing to do with cleverness or grit. Mercier had every reason and every means to make Dunmore vanish, and he chose the harder road instead. Because the 2 people upstairs deserved a man who came home, not one with something to answer for, doing the decent thing when the easy thing is right there, cheaper, and nobody would blame you for it. That's the quiet backbone the whole story stands on. It's why the ending holds. You can't build a home on a foundation you're ashamed of. I keep coming back to Theo learning how to be loud. A kid who'd been taught that joy gets you punished, slowly working out that in this house the noisy ones are the ones who stay. Everything good that found him came downstream of 3 plain things working at once. People brave enough to do right, level-headed enough to do it well, and tough enough to keep at it when quitting would have been simpler. Pull out any one of those and Dunmore wins. So when the boy finally said Dad over a lopsided fox cake, that wasn't luck. It was earned. One small, honest decision at a time. We become what we practice. They practiced this.